Aldo is a professor of artificial intelligence and neuroscience at the Department of Bioengineering and the Department of Computing at Imperial College London. In 2019, he became the founding director of the UKRI Centre for Doctoral Training in AI for Healthcare, and he leads the Behavioural Analytics Lab at the Data Science Institute in London. Aldo works at the interface of machine learning, neuroscience, and translational biomedical engineering to help people in disease and in health. In this space, his work focuses on human augmentation, digital biomarkers, and AI for medical intervention, for which he's received a number of prizes and awards, including, for example, a Research Discovery Prize by the Toyota Foundation. So thank you, Aldo, for talking to us. Aldo's going to tell us about the virtuous cycle, AI for neuroscience and vice versa.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation, and I hope I can address the festive mood. I've just discovered that I cannot share my slides on my PC because there's some weird Zoom bug I'm getting. So I'm just going to switch in a jiffy to my other Zoom account. 1 second.
Okay, no problem. We need some festive music while we wait. Yeah, just remind you to please feel free to keep the chat going and the Q&A, and I'm sure some of the speakers will try and answer you offline as well.
Hi, now I'm back. Thank you very much for putting up with this. I feel AI is not solved till we find ways of basically getting screen sharing to work. Fortunately, I can trust my Mac to work. Okay, so I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to give you something about how we think about human and artificial intelligence. And we very much follow David Marr's vision here that at an abstract level, of course, artificial thought and biological thought follow the same computational strategies and principles, and that we can then at some point talk about the algorithms of a machine, but also the algorithms that operate in our brain. And really only once when we reach the point where we are talking about the actual implementation do we need to think a lot about what are the biophysical constraints on how cells and networks of neurons can operate versus other hardware constraints that we have if we think in silico. So today I really want to talk to you about work surrounding human behavior, human motor control, and human learning, because I think it serves as an excellent example of how we can think about problems that are hard in neuroscience and that are hard in machine learning if we want to think about systems that need to interact. So I'm showing you here a classic picture of the perception action loop, the fact that when you're perceiving information, you have a whole cascade of processes operating, integrating information, learning from these, and then formulating a response. And if you think of this about in the context of biology, the loop of continuously perceiving and acting in the world is a closed loop, and you shouldn't cut that open. So it's very important that when you study brains in function, that you look at them in a closed loop view, and that's very much a human motor control view of the system. I think a lot of sensory neuroscience focuses more on cutting the loop open and looking at stimulus response, but we're interested in the decision-making mechanisms that lead to this interaction between perception and action. And on the other side, if you come from the field of AI, what you're seeing there is that a lot of common perception, public perception, is one of AI as a form of understanding data, so a form of analytics. So here it's mainly about successes that we've seen in deep learning that can perform so-called supervised learning, where you know what the answers are, so you want to train a machine to generalize from these answers and basically keep recognizing your face on your social media. But there's another aspect that is fairly widely underestimated about how AI can transform things, and that's the aspect of agency. So where AI systems actually are actors. And I think the most public manifestation of that is, of course, self-driving cars, systems that can make a whole sequence of decisions and act in this context. So this is where it becomes interesting for us, because here a lot of principles that we have from the interaction in neuroscience have also applications to interactions in machines. But I'm actually not just interested in how machines can interact. I'm more generally interested how machines and humans can interact. And so if you look at the standard world and framework for that, that is the framework of what we call in machine learning reinforcement learning. It's also the same concept more or less in cognitive science and psychology, namely that you have a human that chooses actions and these impact somehow the world, right? That's your motor system outputting things. And then you observe new sensory information that comes back to you, and potentially you score a reward, like a juicy fruit or a cash reward or something else. And we've studied in an exquisite domain to what extent the similarities are here, or actually the equivalences between algorithms that have been formulated in computer science and implementations of computer systems algorithms that basically predict on a neuron by neuron level the activity of, for example, neurons in the brainstem. And so this has been classic applications of what we call computational neuroscience. And basically, we can now understand to a certain extent how these two systems work. What we're interested in is slightly different systems where a human and AI system interact. So you can call it the social neuroscience of a human and a machine, or you can call it human in the loop AI. I don't mind how you market your labels. But the point is that we have a whole range of systems where this is applicable. So very often you have a human interacting with the world, and that's the same loop that's operating as we have in the standard biological setting. But maybe now enhanced or augmented by an agent system, an AI system that gives you a recommendation, for example, in clinical decision support systems. And the important thing is here that a decision support system only makes a recommendation. The human decision maker does not have to follow that recommendation. They can choose to ignore it. For example, if you're self-driving, or the self-driving functionality in your car does not see an oncoming traffic, or if a doctor gets a decision recommendation that to do a certain action, they may just choose to ignore that. So how do we learn in a loop where basically there's a human decision maker at play and sort of an agent that needs to learn from these interactions? Here's, of course, important to learn when does the human ignore the decision. May have multiple reasons. Their decision may not be clear, or the decision may be unreliable. In a different type of settings, we have typically a setting where you have a human who would like to do something, but they're impeded. For example, because they're paralyzed. And so here, or they've lost a limb. So in this case, you have neuroprosthetic technology that tries to decode the intention of the human, for example, to grasp something with a prosthetic hand or to steer a wheelchair. And so again, here, the loops are reversed. So a human effectively suggests something, or the system needs to decode what the human wants, and then actually carries out these actions. And so this gives you a second loop that operates on the artificial systems that needs to learn from interactions in the world, but also sort of needs to count what the human would have liked to be done. So this is not a setting you want to see. You want to see in assistive technology and neurotechnology, but for example, you may not want to see in settings where the legal decision maker is a human. And then you can think about settings that are interactive at both levels. So where the human and the robot directly interact with the world and they need to operate in symbiosis. And I've put here not a Santa Claus, but Iron Man, because interestingly, Iron Man is a great example of that, because the human inside the robotic suit would like to execute certain actions that the robotic suit needs to execute, but the robotic suit also needs to basically influence the movements of the human, for example, to protect the human. So how can you build even systems that can operate and feel natural and learn in this environment? So for that, we've started a few years ago to look at how can we actually quantify these very abstract concepts. So if we talk about motor learning, by the way, the first thing that we observe and realize is that a lot of motor learning is nicely phrased in developmental, learning to play the piano and other things. But actually, we study motor learning in massively reduced and simplified environments. That's because analysis of these environments is very easy. You don't need a sophisticated analysis algorithm. But it reads into the situation where your experimental domain may be so impoverished that you may overlook fundamental principles at work, or you actually design a protocol that separates two principles. An example of that we have recently discovered in looking at motor learning in complex real-world tasks. We studied humans learning to play pool. And we've done that in an unconstrained way. Basically, we simply asked people to shoot the red ball into the socket and basically looked at how they were actually learning. And what's important to remember here is that there are generally two learning processes at work in humans. One is what we call mode adaptation, which is error-based, and one is what we call reward-based learning. And again, each of these is studied with very simple paradigms, such as center outreaching tasks, or, for example, tapping things on a sequence loader. And that's our understanding of these mechanisms. And there's an open debate of how you should build, for example, in robotic systems that combine or not combine error-based and reward-based learning mechanisms together. So understanding this is fundamental for looking at that. So in our pool task, we were basically able, although it's an unconstrained task and very natural, in that many people may have experienced it before, to establish all the classic paradigms of a classic learning task. So the error that you make in shooting the ball into the socket decreases over time, your success rate goes up, and interestingly, we find all the classic effects in controlled experiments. For example, the subjects at the start have a high degree of variability and then control and modulate the variability. But because this is an unconstrained task, we can actually observe and see learning in every single trial, in every single joint of the body. So instead of working and operating in reduced environments, we can have here a richer environment that shows that it's not just the center out reaching task elbow-shoulder angle that matters, but everything in your body learns. And we can do further. We can combine that, for example, with brain activity data, EEG data. And so here in the literature, for example, you find that there's a signature, it's called the post-movement beta, so that's the beta oscillations in your brain, rebound effect, that is taught to be suggestive of either error-based adaptation or reward-based adaptation processes in the brain. Now, interestingly, when you run this experiment, what you find is that across subjects, if you just average things as usual, you don't see a particular impact on the post-movement beta reward. However, when you start looking at the subjects, you find that there's a distinct cluster of subjects for which the post-movement beta is negative, and a separate distinct cluster of subjects for which the post-movement beta is positive. So in other words, some subjects increase the post-movement beta impact and some reduce it over trials. And so this means they're scaling effectively their error-based learning over time and the reward-based learning over time very differently. And interesting, while motor learning, each of these phenomena was individually observed, no one saw these two competing effects at the same time, ultimately because we're looking at a more complex interaction. And so this can help us inform how we want to design experiments for more complex tasks. So here we're looking at an experimental task where we have a human learning interaction with a robot. So this is a maze game, and you have to move this ball into the whole socket here. And so there's a number of technical details I want to spare you, of equations and so forth, that are not further relevant here. But effectively, it's a task where you have to balance board, and the human just controls 1 degree of freedom, and the robot controls another degree of freedom. And so to get this robot to fulfill the task and balance this thing, the ball into the other side, they have to necessarily cooperate. And I was a fairly skeptic if this was possible. By deploying the right reward and error-based learning algorithm mixtures in this algorithm, we can actually achieve that within 30 minutes. And so this is the first manifestation of true interactive human-robot learning. And at the bottom, you see basically that the human subjects are not performing necessarily better than the human-AI combination. Or interestingly, find that the robot learns a specific policy of how to control that based on the person they're playing with. Now, for some people, it turns out that you can basically copy and paste what the robot has learned, and it will work on another person very nicely. But for other people, it turns out if you just copy and paste a learned robotic strategy player, you cannot do that. So there's intimately linked with this learning experience how humans learn and how humans control, and we believe we can link this back to to human learning mechanisms that decide and determine how humans and robots learn. So in the interest of time, let me come now to something slightly more frivolous. And that comes now to how can we actually use this technology meaningfully, or less meaningfully, more frivolously. So all of you know probably, ancient mythology or cartoon characters where you have humans operating, for example, additional limbs. And here you see on the right-hand side a demonstration of a technology that decodes human intention and enables my graduate student here to eat, drink, and paint in all painting at the same time. And the system does that by encoding painting intention of the human user through decoding of the eye movements that the subject does. And this type of technology can help you now, for example, help restoration of movement in paralyzed people. We can take that even further. We can ask, what is if I augment a human beyond the current level? That means that if you have 10 fingers, can I give you an extra finger, a thumb, that you mount contralaterally? And can we learn to control through interactive algorithms that a human can play with piano with 11 fingers? And so here you see a volunteer subject who had a year of piano playing experience and then used this extra robotic thumb within, I think, this is after roughly 30 minutes of playing for the first time. So we can now achieve through the right interactive algorithms and by developing the right hardware, of course, true human augmentation to levels that I didn't think was possible. I actually, when we started this, I didn't think it was possible that a human could use 11 fingers with a normal brain. But you can do that. And so here, just to end my talk, I'm just showing you the slides of how we've taken now this technology further. So this is a fully paralyzed ALS patient with residual neck and virtually no postural control using robotic augmentation technology that they developed that decodes from the eye movements of the subjects the intention of what he would like to do. And the robot learns through our interactive algorithm how the human eye movements and how he's looking at things should be translated into movements of their body, i.e. How the robotic arm should move the wrist, and how the glove, i.e. the fingers of the human subject, what they should do, whether they should grasp things and manipulate things. And this is through basically achieving true symbiosis between the human and the biological learner. And just so you're clear about this, the ALS patient here has been using the system for the first time in their life roughly 15 minutes before this video was shot, just to show that these algorithms can be very rapidly customized if you can teach machines to learn like humans. And really here, I want to come to an end and just thank a fantastic lab that we're having. Work was done by a mixture of neuroscience students, computer science students, mathematicians. We have a few clinicians in the team and a bunch of engineering students. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aldo. Fantastic, lovely demonstrations. We haven't got long, but let's try and squeeze in a couple of questions before we have another break. So Fergus Cunningham asks, other than motor augmentation, how do you imagine this technology could translate into enhancing cognition, like memory, for example?
So I have a whole separate talk on cognitive prosthetics. I think we're looking at this in multiple ways. So one of the most prominent applications that we've developed here is a system that is a clinical decision support system, but is effectively a reinforcement learner that learns to make suggestions for drug treatments in real time in intensive care units. And this system is now being currently deployed in 4 intensive care units across London. And it's a system that basically continuously senses, just like the human senses physiological information and makes recommendation. The key thing here is, however, that any technology that is meant to assist and help humans and not replace them is ultimately dealing with problems of neuroscience, not problems of computer science. And what we don't want is computer scientists basically guessing what is the right system. So here, this loop example, the first one that I showed you in the bottom left, we have this recommender system. So you need to think about how can we make these systems learn from each other. And it's very interesting to observe if you do the right psychophysics experiments, what actually sways the decision of a clinician is very often not the explanation. It can be simply the cold, hard fact that 50 other clinicians made the same decision. But that's a separate talk.
Yes.